Some say that loot boxes kill games. Others say that they are essential for their survival. I'm more interested in two specific issues. Are loot boxes legal and can they be harmful to us? Hi, my name is Szymon Adamus and these are the amazing games. Loot boxes are virtual objects in video games that reward us for our progress in the game or the money we spend in it. Most often they offer a random loot. The historical background in their case is not that important anymore, but it is worth mentioning that their beginnings are older than video games. Magic the Gathering players have been buying random packages of cards since the 1990s. Pokemon or Transformers fans have been doing the same for years, and baseball fans for generations. The first baseball collector's cards appeared in the USA as early as the mid-19th century. Today there is no shortage of physical collector's cards, but most of the money is earned by virtual loot boxes in games. It's not at all that easy to get a legal understanding of loot boxes. Boxes bought in games are never empty, so they are not exactly like the casino slots machines, where sometimes you hit something and sometimes nothing. They are not physical objects and the loot you draw cannot be sold back to the manufacturer. Moreover, their operation is not always identical for every player. Marketing companies know how to track the player's actions in the game and based on that data personalize the offer and even the content of the boxes. To put it in another way, trying to regulate loot boxes is a nightmare. That's why the legal status of loot boxes in games changes from year to year and is very different in different countries. Belgium has approached the topic most specifically. Koen Gins, the Minister of Justice of that country, described the loot boxes in Overwatch, FIFA 18 and Counter-Strike Global Offensive as games of chance, and thus forced the producers to remove them or withdraw entire games from this market. Peter Nessens, director of Belgium Gaming Commission, added, "Paying loot boxes are not an innocent part of video games that present themselves as games of skill. Players are tempted and misled, and none of the protective measures for gambling are applied." Similarly strong decisions were also made in the Netherlands, and China forced manufacturers to give statistics on the percentage chances of finding something in the boxes and quite strongly limited their sales, especially for children and teenagers under the age of 18. Other countries such as Germany, Sweden, France, Japan, Australia and the USA have introduced less restrictive laws and are investigating the subject further. In the vast majority of countries in the world, loot boxes are still very poorly regulated and specific legal solutions are only being developed. All this answers the question whether loot boxes are legal. In most countries, yes, at least for now. Their regulations are slowly appearing and perhaps in some time the legal status of using similar mechanics will oppose them. So far, this is not the case and in most countries loot boxes are fully legal and the discussion about their convergence with gambling is just beginning. But what about the second part of the title questions? Are loot boxes good for us? This is clear. Mechanics of this kind are more harmful to the player the more predisposed he is to addiction. And the fact that loot boxes are not physical objects or substances that we swallow, smoke, or inhale is not important here. Our brains don't really care about it. The limbic system is able to make us addicted to anything, not only drugs but also legal substances such as chocolate, and even behaviors. Neurotransmitters such as serotonin, histamine, and above all dopamine regulate many of our body's activities. The mentioned dopamine participates in the process of feeling pleasure and building the need to repeat pleasant activities. Changes in the level of secretion of neurotransmitter or their modification occur in all addictions, also gambling. Dopamine is released when you win, but not only then. Also when we are very close to winning. For example, in roulette, when the ball falls close to the number we've chosen. Or when in the loot box we find almost all the elements of the equipment we are looking for, and we are very close to collecting the full set. From the evolutionary side, it makes sense. The human brain has been perfectly trained to see patterns and everything that breaks them. For example, random events. All of this is to make it easier to detect pleasant stimuli and to strive to repeat them. This is not a problem in nature because random events that give us pleasure are quite rare. In games, the same evolutionary mechanics are used in a deliberate way. Some respond to them stronger, others weaker. But without unusual changes in the brain, it is impossible to be fully immune to this type of stimuli. We can talk for hours about brain chemistry, and every next minute would plunge the issue of addiction to loot boxes more. Unfortunately, this is not necessary because we already have enough examples taken from life. On Reddit you can read, for example, the post of Cadence, who wrote to support of the Path of Exile game with a request to disable the loot boxes mechanics in this game. Cadence has problems with gambling addiction and was slowly losing control over compulsive buying and opening loot boxes. In her case, everything ended very positively. The support disabled the mystery box function on her account and allowed her to enjoy her favorite game without the risk of addiction. Cadence found help from a therapist and is coping with her addiction. The problem is that it does not always look like this. Some companies don't block such functions, others even intensify them, and cases like Cadence or worse multiply. In the 2017, Kotaku wrote about the case of Kensgold, a 19-year-old player who had spent more than $13,000 in games such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Smite or The Hobbit. 13,000, which accounted for about 90% of his income at the time. Kensgold writes on Reddit that he does not resent companies that use microtransactions in their games, but asks to inform that they are more dangerous than buying a pack of chewing gum. At my worst, I was working 2 jobs and considering dropping out of high school. Please consider how unregulated microtransactions can affect the youth of the world. It was the end of the year 2017. Today there are more similar and even much worse cases. In March 2019, BBC wrote about a man who spent £700 a month on loot boxes. A year later, the topic returned to the BBC, showing another player who spent £3,000 in FIFA. He had been saving the money for college education. WJLA TV station made a piece about loot boxes in which a 17-year-old Benjamin Malek from Canada talks about how he spent $7,600 on boxes in FIFA 16.
It feels like what happens if you open up a mobile game and you spin a slot machine. You know, the flashing lights, the colors. It feels good to open, but it's just, it shouldn't, because that can really hook some people in.
It would be unfair to blame it only on users who give it to temptations, mainly because some game developers do not behave ethically, and despite knowing the harmful mechanics of loot boxes that can lead to addiction, they still implement these methods of monetization. Sometimes they even do it because they can have this effect. In June of 2019, Kerry Hopkins, Vice President of Legal and Government Affairs of Electronic Arts, answered questions of the British House of Commons. When asked about ethical side of loot boxes, at first she tried hard to convince politicians that it's not loot boxes, but surprise mechanics.
So what we look at as surprise mechanics.
I don't understand this line of defense a bit, because if The Witcher taught us anything, it's the fact that surprise can be a very powerful tool.
that I come to claim what is rightfully mine. Pavetta, by the law of surprise.
The attempt of such an Orwellian change of language in favor of some interests is nothing in relation to completely open, taught without any embarrassment marketing and sales tactics, which we have heard about in the context of loot boxes and microtransactions. For example, in 2016 at the Pocket Gamer Connect's Helsinki conference, Torulf Jernström, president of Tribe Flame Company, spoke about the tricks that can be used to monetize free-to-play games as effectively as possible. At the very beginning of his speech, Torulf warned that some viewers may be shocked by what they hear, but the moral issues of the presented solutions are left for another conversation.
Some of you will probably be slightly shocked by all the tricks I have listed here, but I'll leave the morality of it out of the talk. We can discuss it if we have time later.
The full speech of Torulf can be found on the Pocket Gamers Biz channel. And this is the main problem with loot boxes. It's not that Jernström talks about these techniques. It's good that he did so in a public conference because at least the players and politicians have found about them. It's about how easily and even nonchalantly he does it. The producers are well aware of how questionable and ethically slippery loot boxes and microtransactions are. After all, they are experts in this field. There are even cases when they distance themselves from such practices in protection of the company's image. CD Projekt Red, a company that has its own problems but has been effectively building a player-friendly image for years, when asked about microtransactions in Cyberpunk 2077, said bluntly, "We leave greed to others." Let's not fool ourselves. This is a business and image decision. CD Projekt Red knows its audience and knows what they expect. But it shows how questionable these mechanics are. If there was nothing wrong with them, they wouldn't pose a threat to the company's image. Maybe loot boxes and microtransactions should have such a patch of shame and embarrassment. Perhaps moral issues in discussion about such tricks should not be put aside for another conversation. Maybe they should always be an integral part of discussion about this type of money-making techniques.
But I'll leave the morality of it out of the talk. We can discuss it if we have time later.
Mainly because although the law, as usual, clearly does not keep up with technology, there is no doubt on the scientific side. Loot boxes and many techniques of their implementation in games use human reflexes which we are not always able to fully control, and they can lead to addiction. When reading about legal and business issues, it is easy to forget that there are people on the other side, real people. You can get addicted to almost anything. Some substances, such as heroin or methamphetamine, for example, act more strongly and are more dangerous. Therefore, more is said about them. Other things work slower, so we ignore them. But let me repeat, you can get addicted to almost anything. Technology is not an exception. Dr. Gary Small, who together with Gigi Vorgan wrote the book iBrain, Surviving the Technological Alternation of the Modern Mind, writes on Psychology Today. It is not the technology itself that is addictive, but rather the specific application of choice. People can get hooked on internet searching, online dating, web shopping, porn sites, online gambling, or even checking their mail. Loot boxes don't have to ruin lives. You can add them in the game for free as reward for progress. You may not follow every step and decision of the player to adjust the mechanics based on multi-layered data about player behavior so that he is more and more willing to pay for the next box. You can approach the issue in 100 different ways, only some of which will be harmful. The problem is that many companies don't do it. Instead, they use loot boxes to maximize revenue without worrying about the ethical issues of their practices, the well-being or even health of their players. Until this changes, either voluntarily or under pressure from more restrictive laws, we have to watch out for loot boxes and what they can do to our reflexes and desires. Thanks for visiting my channel. Let me know in the comments what do you think about loot boxes and whether they are a problem for you. And in the meantime, take care, you wonderful people. Bye.
Oh!